Aloha, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the FFF Show, where Jim Hochberger and myself are going to be delving in once again to what is happening with the Lahaina fire and the reports that are out there. What are you, the community? What kind of questions are you asking about it? Is the report final? Where do we go from here? And I think you're going to want to stay tuned, because when Jim and I are actually going to crack open the report that was just released in mid-April, but we're also going to tell you what's coming up, because the report in and of itself is not done yet. And we know there are a lot of questions out there in the community. So let's chat about that. Jim.
Hey.
You know, when I was preparing for the show today, right, because we're going to talk about the Lahaina fire report, I was thinking about your process of moving. And I was thinking that in your case, right, you're moving from the beautiful state of Hawaii. And I want all of you right now that are listening and watching on YouTube to just put in a comment right now about how much you're going to miss Jim. I'm sure he'll appreciate those comments. He's going to be filming just a couple more shows, and then he's off to the new adventures of the mainland. But
That's true.
But I was thinking about your process of moving, right? It was a long process. You've got to go through and you not only moved your house, you also moved your law practice, or had to close an office.
Correct.
Plus you had to close Hawaii Family Advocates.
Correct.
So the steps that people have to do when they are vacating one property and going into the next, it's a long process. It takes a lot of work. It's frustrating at times. But people in Lahaina, they didn't have that kind of opportunity to pack up their things and move. I mean,
Correct.
They had a wildfire that ravaged the place that they lived. They took property, they took homes, they took families, they took businesses, and people didn't have time to prepare. In fact, I think as we jump into the report,
I think it was a total freak out.
It's obvious,
Yeah.
you know, and I just want to remind our viewers some of the facts about the Lahaina fire, because I think it puts into perspective what we're talking about today. So the 2023 Maui fire, do you know that it ranks among the top 10 deadliest U.S. wildfires on record since 1871?
More than the Chicago fire?
The Chicago fire is probably in that list, but it's ranked among the top 10.
Remember Mrs. O'Malley's
The
cow or
cow
something
that knocked
kicked over
over
the lantern and it burned down the town, the city?
It would be interesting to look at that list and actually.
And then there was a San Francisco
the
huge
San
fire.
Francisco fire, yeah. So it is noted as the deadliest natural disaster in Hawaii's history, surpassing the tsunami of 1960, which
The Hilo.
my dad talks about that. He was in school at the time. And yeah, he has memories because he was on Maui at the time, and he remembers that a lot of the tourists, when the water went out, they said the fish was kind of jumping or whatever. So people thought, hey, that's pretty cool. Let's go out and check it out. You know, so by the time they got out there, we're checking out, the waters came rolling back in, and it was a pretty sad situation. So as of January of this year, there have been.
So when was the fire?
The fire was on August. Oh, I did.
8th and 9th.
I was going to say August 8th and 9th, but yes.
Of 2023.
Right.
Okay.
And leading up to the fire, we want to remind everybody that already the National Weather Service was warning people that there were going to be high winds, because there was a hurricane that was kind of off the coast there. And so there was some expectation that there was going to be some negative stuff that were going to happen. I mean, people in Hawaii, we deal with wind all the time. You know, when I was playing
I break wind a lot. I'm getting older.
Well, just don't do it in this small room, because neither I nor our producer behind the camera will be appreciative of sharing that with you. But I think when I was doing Mother Marianne, one of the lines in the play talked about the devil winds of Paliku.
Correct.
Right, because there are.
Which, by the way, I was on Molokai last week hunting.
And did you survive the devil winds?
No, but we went up to the overlook down into the peninsula, the Kalaupapa Peninsula. I had never actually read any of those plaques or looked down there to figure out what was what. It was pretty interesting. And I noticed that you need to change some of the lines in your play because the seas weren't rough at all. It would be an easy swim.
No.
I saw it this past week.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're not a weather reporter. So anyway, going back to August 7th, there was already warnings that were coming out that these big winds was going to happen. And so when the winds started, a lot of the people in leadership were kind of prepared for what was happening with the winds. So let's keep that in mind, that's kind of what was going on at the time. There have been 101 confirmed deaths, loss of life,
fatalities.
And we want to make sure that we don't ever talk about a situation like that without being mindful of the fact that people have lost
but before
family
we
members.
run out of time, we should explain the legislative report versus this report and the next part of this report, because we're coming up on our
we will get there. I just want to remind everybody of what we're talking about here. And then I also want to remind everybody that as of January 2024, now the numbers have gone down, but in January 2024, they were saying that 5,400 people in Maui were still displaced. And I know that number has gone down. I know that through the legislative process, they've been adding funds to provide temporary housing. And maybe later on in the show, we'll talk a little bit about that. So what I want you all to stay tuned, because what we're going to do for this first part is we're going to talk about the summary. And then in the second part of the show, we're going to be talking about the Newsweek. There's a Newsweek article because there's a specific individual that Jim Hochberg has been trying to do research and find out what happened to this person. So you want to know who we're talking about that. So let's jump into it. So there was the first report. So
remember the legislature came out. We're going to find out what happened.
Right.
And we have a whole show on that. Go look at it.
Right.
They didn't actually ask the one question that they needed to ask. Now, the Attorney General last year said she was going to do a report. And so she hired the Fire Safety Research Institute,
which I thought was a great thing.
Yeah,
they do this for a living. They know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing. Yeah. So they've come out with the first half of the report. What they've done is said, here is all the data we've collected. These are the subpoenas that we issued, the responses we got, all this kind of stuff. But there's going to be a second half of this Attorney General report by the Fire Safety Research Institute that's going to synthesize the data to give us conclusions.
Right.
So there's no conclusions in this at all.
And they didn't answer the question in this first report that was released in mid-April. They did not answer the question of what caused the fire, right? They were just doing...
Well, there's no conclusion.
All they're doing is fact-finding. They did timelines of who was doing what. And actually, I don't know if you took a look at the timeline that they actually...
I took a look at all of
it. It was really, they went detailed. They did a Google...
It wasn't really a timeline. What it was...
They did a Google spreadsheet and allowed people to plug in.
Well, but what they had was, by this office, this was their communication timeline. This office, this was theirs. I kind of wish they had integrated them all.
Yeah. I do want to give a quick shout out to Civil Beat, because Civil Beat has really been following the report and been doing a lot of articles about it. So if you have a chance, check out a lot of the reports that were done by Civil Beat. All right, so let's, as we start to transition, what was the biggest takeaway that you got from this summary?
That they should have not broken it down into two pieces, because by the time the third piece comes out, people are going to be so sick and tired of this. It's going to go, I think, largely unread. So
what do you think about the this idea, though, that it's 199 pages? I mean, do you think people are going to read it?
Most people will not.
Right.
It needs to be covered adequately in the news, which is why we're doing it. But I think by the time the third part comes out, the second part of the second piece, it's not even going to get covered hardly in the news because it's old information. They should have put it all together at once, I think.
Okay, well, let's get your thoughts on the summary itself, because I know that you had some thoughts when you read the summary.
So basically, the summary gathered information. who said what to who on what day, at what hour, and what minute, what people were in what locations at what days and what times, what conditions were there. There's a whole bunch of parts at the beginning that explains how does the Maui water system work, which was kind of interesting. And they had little computer-generated drawings of the big water tower that goes down to the little water tower on this street up above, and then the big water tower goes down to this other
report,
water tower.
But not answering the questions. I hear you.
But they didn't in there address the fire hydrants. The fire hydrants was in one sentence that said the drinking water on Maui, it comes from these three sources. It includes drinking water for commercial, for residential. It includes sewer, flushing of toilets and waste through things, and fire hydrants. And so they don't have any fire hydrants on their little graph, which they could have put fire hydrants, because that's the critical information. Why did Lahaina burn? There wasn't water in the fire hydrants. But they're, again, not really addressing that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you look at the summary talks about how it was around, I guess there was a fire that they caught the morning of the 8th. The fire department went there. They got the fire under control. And I don't remember the exact time, but they did get it out and they left the area in their report. That's what they're saying in the summary.
You mean they put the fire out?
They put the fire out and they left the area. But within half an hour, the fire struck up again right in that exact same area, and the fire department returned. Now, what's interesting is the Hawaiian Electric Company is taking responsibility for the first fire, because what they were saying is, yes, that there was a line that went down that I guess struck some of the dried flora and fauna that was there and kind of just sparked the fire. But they're not taking responsibility for the second fire that took place in the same place. And there are unbelievable amount of lawsuits right now, not only against HECO. There are lawsuits. Did you know that there's lawsuits right now against all of the cell phone, T-Mobile, Verizon.
Why the cell phones?
Because there were actually the county. So this is a lawsuit from the county of Maui. They're saying that they sent out warnings to people through their cell phones, and it was not sent. None of the carriers sent them out. So there's a lawsuit against the cell phones.
I think the county did the EGA bad distribution of warning material.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
the ICBMs from North Korea, if you remember.
I remember that. Yes, there were a lot of none of the conspiracy theories have proven. I don't want to discount people's fears about the government, because there are people out there that have real fears about the potential of what the government could do, right? So I don't want to just knock them to the side, but I do know that, at the time of the fire, when the reports came out early, people were saying there were thousands of people dead, and that the government wasn't reporting all these deaths. Now, none of that has panned out so far, so let's see what happens moving forward. But we do know there are people that are still deployed. Okay.
So the summary says that there's going to be an incident analysis report that they call Phase 2, which will be this organization's independent analysis of the facts that are in Phase 1. And they'll detail the conditions influencing the preparedness and all that kind of stuff. But there will also be a forward-looking report, Phase 3, of this comprehensive independent analysis that will answer critical questions about, what do you think the critical questions are?
Well,
I would think the critical question is, why did the town burn down? That's not the critical question. The critical question is, quote, how do we prevent this from happening again?
I think that's a critical question. I mean,
but they haven't even answered the real thing.
I know, but I'm not saying that it's not a good question. I'm just saying that. I do think it's a good question. It may not be the only question. And when I'm looking at the report, and I tell you, my eyes were glazing over because I was trying to get through all 199 pages of this report, and it is there's a lot of minutia in there, right? And I was just trying to see. It's all
minutia.
Did I want to hone in on one particular thing? But I think the bottom line is it almost seemed like a comedy of errors. You know, there was the storm that was happening, the high winds were happening, electric lines went down, caused fires, didn't cause fires, cell phones didn't work. The police department were trying to do the very best they could. They said the visibility got to be so bad at some point. People were posting on Facebook from their phones saying that they were told to get back in their car and go back into the fire. There were people that were jumping from land into a very rough ocean because that was their choice, burn to death in their car or face what was happening in the ocean. Bodies pulled out, you know, people that drowned. I mean, can you imagine what people were going through at that moment? What would you do? You're in a car, you've got a fire coming this way, and you've got a hurricane waves happening in front of you. What would you do?
I have no idea.
My heart goes out to these people. I did
see a video of people in the bay with T-shirts over their faces to be able to breathe because it was totally smoky.
Yeah, I know. And even there were, I don't know if people are aware of this, but there were police officers and firemen and maybe women that actually had to be medevaced out of the situation because it was like everything happened so fast. And then the questions, which is I think what normal people are looking at. People are looking at this report and they're going, okay, it's great that you've got 24 fire hydrants, or it's great that this is how the water system works or whatever. But we want to know why the communication break, because that's really what I got out of that summary is that there is obviously a communication breakdown, right? People were doing their jobs, but not necessarily talking to each other. And I think that's what was causing a lot of the confusion out in the community. And I think that's what people want to know. Why did that happen?
And that's not really, I think, what they're going to be answering, although they should. But there was insufficient water in the system in Lahaina to fight the fire. And that is, you have to fix that problem to answer the question, how can we make sure this never happens again? You can't have insufficient water in the firefighting system.
And I know in fact, this last portion of the show, that's where we're going to talk about the missing piece that really drove you nuts. I mean, from the time it happened, you were like being sleuth trying to find out why this individual was escaping the kind of scrutiny that this individual should have gotten.
Because that's what we do in the state of Hawaii.
Right.
We are more concerned about public shame than the death of 101 people. And it really pisses me off.
Okay. So we're talking about, just so that people get this picture in their head, we are talking about 2,170 acres or 3.4 square miles of damage.
A lot of that was upcountry grass before it hit the city.
And 2,200 structures damaged. So that's what we're talking about. So now moving on to this next segment where we're going to talk about water. One of the things that was happening is the water was not available for use. There were people that were heroes that were not police officers or fire departments. I mean, the one thing about Hawaii is that when there's a crisis, people rise to the occasion. I mean, you can look back at the history of Hawaii, and anytime anything happens, neighbors help neighbors, right? This is what they do. So you had human beings out there trying to use their hoses and trying to help, and there is no water. And that was the big issue that
There was a lot of water.
But
it was called the ocean.
Well.
And do you know what pumps are? Why did they not come down there with pumping machines, put them in the ocean, and pump the water out at the fire?
Well, you'd have to ask professionals why they didn't jump to that. But go into this one individual that, I mean, this was a big thing for you.
Okay, so let's talk about Newsweek.
Okay.
In September, mid-September of 2023, Newsweek magazine, and you can find it at newsweek.com, had an article. The title was, Who is Kaleo Manuel? Maui water official faces scrutiny over fire response. Articles written by Julia, spelled Giulia. I think she eats pasta. Carbonaro. So There was a letter written August 10th, which August 8th fire, August 9th fire, August 10th, the day after the fire.
Well, people were already talking about, so before a letter was even written, we were watching conversations happening by people saying that this person that you just mentioned had made some decisions that were questionable. Okay, so now take us to the letter.
So this letter is written to the deputy director of the Water Commission on Maui, M. Kaleo Manuel, describing problems with communication that resulted in delay in diverting streams to fill the reservoirs being made available to firefighters. As a lawyer or as a Bible scholar, evidence that is generated very close to the event is very reliable compared to evidence that is generated
when you
farther
move far
away.
Yeah.
Right? So this was on the 10th.
Because recollections may vary and fade.
And as time passes by, people need to cover their butts, so stories mold a little bit.
And witnesses pass away.
So here's the thing about the letter. So West Maui Land Company, it's a private company on Maui. They manage 3 of the water providers on West Maui. As the fire was ravaging the island, this is the Newsweek article, the company said firefighters had used what little water they had in their reservoirs and tanks, so they asked the Water Commission to divert water from streams to enable them to, quote, store as much water as possible for fire control. Instead of approving the request, the commission, according to the letter sent by the company to Manuel, asked them if the Maui Fire Department had requested permission to dip into the reservoirs and told them to inquire with local farmers first to check how a diversion of the water supply would affect them. So kalo, or whatever else they're growing upcountry on Maui, the farmers had to approve, I suppose, according to Mr. Manuel. So the story goes on to say, the company in this letter complained that communications were spotty and the commission's approval to divert water from the stream came too late, 5 hours after the first request. That's why that fire did what it did. 5 hours is a long time in a hurricane wind for fire to burn. So then here's a quote. "We watched the devastation around us without the ability to help," close quote, the company wrote in the letter. Quote, "We anxiously waited the morning knowing that we could have made more water available to the Maui Fire Department if our request had been immediately approved." So then this Newsweek story looks at Manuel's social media, and they resurfaced a clip that shows him discussing protecting water resources for the farmers. Quote, he's quoted in this thing as saying, "We can share it, but it requires true conversations about equity."
Oh, no, I already know. I already know how you feel about that word, Jim.
So how I feel about that word is this. All of you folks with preferred pronouns, I have preferred punctuation. You want to talk to me, I'm kind of hard of hearing. I want exclamation points at the end of everything. You got to yell so I can hear you.
Okay, Jim.
Thank you.
Everybody's watching TV right now is like, what just happened? The dogs are hiding under the...
Okay. So while the investigation was going on, Mr. Manuel has been reassigned to another role within the department.
He resigned in December.
Well, no, but this is September.
Yeah,
right?
so he ended up resigning in September.
And then they quote in this article, the purpose of this deployment, putting him in another job, is to permit the Water Commission and the department to focus on necessary work to assist the people of Maui, to recover from the wildfires. And the deployment does not suggest that First Deputy Manuel did anything wrong. So the article ends with the department not specifying what role Mr. Manuel was reassigned to. So what is very frustrating, and it's one of the reasons that I'm happy not to be living here anymore after a couple of weeks, This is what the government here does because people elect them over and over. If they had a fear of being unelected, they wouldn't do this stuff.
Okay, but you're going to have some people listening going, yeah, but this individual you're talking about was not an elected position.
I'm talking about the legislative report and the attorney general who works for the governor.
But the connection can be made, however, that all of these positions are appointed by the people you do elect.
Exactly.
So I think that's what I really want people to start thinking about during this upcoming election season is that you can't just vote for someone because you went to school with them or because they're related to somebody you know, or they've been in office for 20 years. You just trust them. They're a nice person, you know. You have to think about what actions they do in that office that they run, right?
No, that we should be. And I hope, because I say it so often on this show, that people have begun to actually consider voting to be a big asset that they should be using because they own it. And that includes, like right now, because 2024 is an election year, right now, to be helping good candidates get elected in place of the people that we need to unelect. You can't just get your ballot and pick off of it.
Yeah, and you've really got to have conversations with people because even like we do a voter guide, as you know, during every election season. Even the voter guide doesn't tell you everything you need to look at who this person surrounds themselves with, because they may look good on paper, or maybe they're a politician enough to know how to answer questions because they know who's getting them. You know, our voter guide, as you know, asks, do you support, oppose, or undecided? And the undecided tends to be where they go when they don't want to make somebody mad or they don't know how you're going to take their answer. But I think you also have to ask yourself, what kind of people will this person appoint or vote for or support to put commissions? And I mean, you and I have laughed over the years at the appointment of people to commissions.
Correct.
I mean, we could do a whole show on how the commissions that are appointed by Hawaii's legislature is not always balanced, and it's not always
balanced. Fair. It's always with
I would never use the word. I would never use the word.
Well, I was
never.
on one.
No, I know you were, and I participated in a lot of those meetings, just being there to watch. You know, after you go, we really do have to talk about some of these fun things that we experience. But so in this last couple of minutes, Jim, I share with everybody, because, you know, you were talking about this water situation and why. What was the first, when you got a copy of the report, you immediately emailed me and you said, I did a search.
I told my computer, because it was a PDF. So I told my computer, find Kaleo, didn't find it. Said, find Manuel, didn't find it. And so it was like, what is this?
And why did that bother you so much? That
because he's the guy that didn't give the water because he wanted the farmers to decide if it was equitable or not. That's why his name is so important.
All right. Well, so you and I in this discussion today, we've only gotten into part of what we're going to talk about. So Jim and I are going to come back next week, and we're going to finish up talking about this report. And we're going to talk about there are subpoenas out there right now. And Jim can explain the process of a subpoena, but what's happened is some of these subpoenas have not been responded to.
Correct.
Right?
And some were issued multiple times. We'll talk about
So we'll talk about that on the next show. We're also going to talk about there's a log that
there's a legal requirement that when there is a FEMA issue, everybody that goes in and comes out of the FEMA office during the response, they have to log in and they have to log out. And the purpose for that is to know who's there when, because things happen and people have to be held accountable.
So you want to make sure you listen to the next show, because we're going to get into that. We're going to find out what is odd about this report. We're also going to tell you what the biggest searches are on Google about the Lahaina fire. So
and all the money that's being spent to provide housing that nobody lives in.
Yeah. So stay tuned for next week. Make sure you like this video, share, subscribe, hit that notification button so you know every time we upload a new video. And we will see you next week. Mahalo, everybody.
Aloha.